I don't think that I know what it's like to be a tree or a bird or soil or a river. I don't. I often wonder, and I do my best as a as one of the guys, one of the gang, to find some common ground.
Hey folks, welcome to the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. This is the last episode of season 1, and I don't think we could end with a better guest. Our guest is Jeff Perry, founder of Angel City Lumber, a really unique place-based lumberyard in Los Angeles that sources only from fallen trees, trees removed in construction, and trees removed due to things like disease in Los Angeles County. And the thoughtfulness in Jeff's approach to lumber is really only part of Jeff's overall thoughtfulness as a person. In this episode, we discuss what it means to not think about our role as humans as stewards or saviors of the more than human world, but really as just one of the gang. We also talk about how industrialized lumber has created separation between us and the trees that for so many of us are really fixtures in our lives. And in this way, Angel City Lumber's approach is helping maintain those connections using technology like QR codes to reconnect a piece of flooring or a board with the tree that it came from and where that tree itself is from. But this conversation stretches far beyond lumber. Jeff shares his perspective about how, as just one of the gang, we need to do more listening and less pontificating, adjusting for our human impulse to fix. His connection with trees goes deeper than lumber, taking time to listen and connect with them often. This one is a little bit longer, but well worth your time. So without further delay, I hope you enjoy this conversation with Jeff Perry, founder of Angel City Lumber in Los Angeles. Today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, we are excited to be joined by Jeff Perry, founder of Angel City Lumber in Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us today, Jeff.
Thanks so much for having me, Rick. Excited to speak to you.
As the founder of Angel City Lumber, which is a unique lumber yard, you only source wood from Los Angeles County, primarily from trees felled by storms, cut down due to disease, or sort of already removed or being removed for construction. So in the context of running and founding a lumber business and as an individual in Los Angeles, a city in the middle of the desert, like how do you think about your relationship with nature and the more than human world?
Boy, that is a good question. I mean, I would say um, trying to think of myself as as a human, but as a decentralized member of our surroundings. I think we often think of ourselves as stewarding or looking after or you know needing to supervise or chaperone our surroundings, even with the best intentions. But often I think that perspective also puts us, it still even puts us on the outside of nature, and therefore we are not a part of it, even if we're intending to be or trying to show up for nature in that way. Uh, my relationship to nature is I'm one of the gang, so to speak, and so are we all. All of us at Angel City Lumber are, we are not stewarding these trees in our urban setting or in Los Angeles. We're with them. We're one of their brethren, and as with the trees, as with everything else that comes in our environments.
I love that. I think there's many ways that people try to sort of verbally frame that idea that we're all on the same level. And I think this idea of being one of the gang, I probably will end up stealing and using in future episodes. I will try to remember to give you credit, but if I don't, feel free to call me out at any point. But it's you actually, Angel City is a really interesting business that you're kind of bringing this approach to. I think when people think of the lumberyard, they might think of one of the big box retailers or even a local lumberyard. But it's sort of nondescript in a lot of ways. And obviously, we mentioned you source only wood from LA County. And I was on your website on the slab store, which is a little bit different than I think most lumberyard websites. You've got these amazing slabs, and there's details on the neighborhood where the tree grew and its species. And I was mentioning to you, I fell in love with a slab of coast redwood from Los Feliz, while I was, sending it around to friends and family members. Like, sort of, I would send pictures of my cat. I was like, this is an amazing piece of wood.
Yeah.
It's a totally different way to present something that feels very utilitarian.
Mhm.
People think about it as material and not necessarily much more than that. So, like, as a lumberyard that could probably do things the way everyone else does and probably be reasonably successful, why go to these extra lengths of naming and identifying and photographing these individual slabs?
So I think really what it comes down to is building material is faceless. So if lumber for a building, a construction project, or even a cosmetic millwork or casework project shows up on a truck, it is a material. It is something that the builder says, "Got it. I've got my objective here. This is what my medium is, and I will go to work." Um, that's just status quo. So it's interesting to me, though, especially starting with Angel City Lumber. As a former carpenter, I thought it was really interesting how people are really excited to keep trees standing. They're really connected to trees in their neighborhood, which is lovely. They people actually do connect with trees. I think for probably a number of reasons, more so than other parts of the more than human world. But people really stand by their trees. They don't want to see any harm done. They want to, again, steward them, or do whatever it is to ensure their health. And it's interesting to me the disconnect between that and wood is a building material. And I think it's just simply because that whole process of manufacturing wood gets externalized or outsourced, or the the commercially grown forests are not typically within eyeshot of people. What we're doing is, well, the trees that are within eyeshot of people, and in fact, these trees are trees that when I go back and I tell these people where that tree was from, I mean, you would be so shocked in a metropolis the size of Los Angeles, where there, oh, I know exactly where that. I know exactly where that was, and sometimes I even know that tree. And when those people are utilizing the wood from that particular tree, they're not thinking of it as, hey, this showed up on a pallet on a flatbed. They're thinking of it as, wow, this was a living being whose legacy can live on, and we can remember this living organism. It ties it together quick. So I think the phrase everyone's using is place based. By having a place based lumber supply, it basically takes the utilitarianism and turns it into utilitarianism from a material that is from a living being, an animate being. And people resonate with it. It's not a hard sell. I think it's already inside of us. People think about their neighborhood trees differently. And I think that's really the biggest thing that we're after.
I had a little bit of a spark there when you explain it that way, because it reminds me a lot of how people often describe like our industrialized food system. We're disconnected from, whether it be livestock or even just the farmer who grew your vegetables. Like it's way out there, and it was not something we necessarily see. And then through something like a CSA box, like a community supported agriculture box, we start to understand like, oh, this is the farmer. They drop off the box at our house, or we go and pick it up, and all of a sudden there's this more meaningful connection. So
Mm-hmm.
was that part, when you're thinking about developing this entirely new approach to doing lumber, like was that part of your thinking? Like what led you to say like, I want to create this place-based lumber company that makes this connection with people and gives them this joy? Because we kind of already see that when sometimes you'll be at a hotel or a restaurant and they're like, oh, this is a reclaimed bench from this church down the street, or this is a reclaimed piece of wood of here. But now you're actually finding out like this is a tree from the corner of this street in Los Feliz or something like that.
Yeah, back, like, funnel it down back to the source of this, again, this tree, this being, right? Um, this so from a process standpoint, what we're doing is, yes, currently we are tracking the tree from when it comes into our facility, the harvest date, the species, and the neighborhood from whence it came is part of the identifier for that log, right? So that when people are purchasing wood from Angel City Lumber, they're able to know where the tree came from and what species it is, right? And when it was harvested. We're going a step further because that was like the bare basics. Like that's what we needed to basically tie people as best we could initially. Now we've gotten our sea legs, we're up and running a little more. What we're doing actually in 2025 is we're basically creating a story. We're trying as best we can to create a story that's represented by like a QR code so that every piece of wood in and around the warehouse can be basically zoomed in on a phone, whether it's a board, a slab, a piece of flooring, whatever it is, and you will get essentially the image of the tree. You'll get, of course, where it's from. You'll get a blurb. This was the Torres's tree. They've lived in this home in Montebello for 7 generations, and the last 3 generations played in this tree, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're even going to go as far as to, and this is where we joke around. We think it's like a out of a Portlandia episode. Like we're gonna name the tree. We're gonna give the tree a name. I know we're gonna probably receive some flack there as like we're trying to anthropomorphize these trees. Um, I'm like, okay, sure, that might be the case. Maybe it is anthropomorphizing, but I do think it is in the sense of we're treating this tree as a person or as one of the folks.
Yeah, and you're a carpenter as well. And so thinking about being one of the gang and, potentially these slabs and these trees, having names, being identified, being on the same level as you. You've got some beautiful design projects on the Angel City website, restaurants and houses and things like that.
Mhm.
As a carpenter, like how then do you think about using those slabs? Does that change in any way than if you were getting the sort of off the shelf stuff at Home Depot?
I think it matters to most carpenters where wood comes from. I think there's a utilitarian, like, is the wood workable? Can I get my job done? Uh, which is fair. Um, However, the way I started and the way I fell in love with wood was just seeing the cosmos in wood. I mean, just by looking at grain all day, you're kind of susceptible to seeing patterns in there that you're like, I've seen this before, or this is linked to common patterns that you see, around in nature and beyond. So yeah, I think it matters. I think just calling it out that it's a reminder. It's, oh yeah, right. This is a tree after all, and it does deserve my attentiveness and my attention.
What I think is interesting is you talked about how you fell in love with wood and seeing sort of the cosmos in the wood, and you sent me some background information that has some quotes from Robin Wall Kimmerer's book Gathering Moss, which I think most of our guests probably only read Braiding Sweetgrass, never got to the other one.
Sure.
But there's definitely, I think, some parallels there between like moss and lichen, and something that's seemingly like infinite and indescribable because it's so overwhelming. Like it's hard to, unless you get down there with a microscope and actually examine the moss, like you don't see the individual patterns. And I guess you could say the same with wood. Like when you look at a giant slab, especially slab after slab, it can all sort of get lost there, and you might lose appreciation in that way, the same way people trample over moss. So can you talk a little bit about Robin's work? Obviously inspired your mission at Angel City. I'm sure there's other sources. And so when you think about this mission that you share, reconnecting Angelitos with nature by manufacturing the gift of wood from our fallen neighborhood trees, one gift That's a really interesting thing. You might want to unpack a little bit for our listeners. But two, how was that influence from Robin's work or any other sources to create this mission of reconnecting people through something that might just be seen as utilitarian and in aggregate not that unique, but actually is quite unique?
Great question. So Robin Wall Kimmerer, David Abram, um, William Bryant Logan, these people gave me a vernacular, or like a way to articulate what I had been feeling for a long time. Um, but there was a lot of fumbling and finding my way, and then I found those people and I was like, oh my God, yeah, yes. Um, when I started Angel City Lumber, I had I still have them, two children. I now have three. But the two children that I'm talking about were very, very little, and I was a carpenter, and it was custom work, and it was very feast or famine. When I saw a particular tree in Altadena, close to here, close to Northeast LA, downed in a storm, a codominant trunk tree downed in a storm, my first thought wasn't we need to reconnect ourselves to our surroundings. My first thought was, oh my God, I think this might be my next commission. I think I could use this, and I think I could sell it. I think I could feed my family with it. I think, it was very pragmatic and practical. When I found out what happens I tried to get that tree. I tried to utilize that tree in essentially like in furniture, and then sell it as locally sourced because I thought that would be attractive. So there was an opportunism there, like just cards on the table. There was I don't want to say desperation, but there was like I got to figure this out. And with those little kids, I was often working in the shop late, and I would often listen to podcasts, and I would listen to, yes, Robin Wall Kimmerer, David Abram, Carl Sagan, Joseph Campbell, all these people that really had a big influence on my life. And there was this element of like, no matter what it is that you do, whatever your occupation is, there is some element of you being able to contribute to your greater surroundings in a good way. Then I was like, okay, well, I'm a carpenter. How does that work, right? And then I started learning more about Suzanne Simard's work with mycorrhizal networks. This is around like 2014. A lot of her work was becoming more well known. And I was just, wow, like everybody else, just blown away by that. But as a carpenter, I felt more close to it, I think, than the average person. So I was like, no, I work with trees all the time. You don't understand. These are my people. So it became eventually, the mission was, wait a minute, we need to reconnect with our trees that are in our community, because right now what's happening, what I learned from Eaton Canyon was that if a tree is able to decompose in a given place, most people will encourage that for wildlife, for soil biome, for all of the right reasons. But in an urban environment, more often than not, it's a hazard, it's a liability, it's all these things. And those trees get carted off, bucked up at the end of their life, bucked up meaning cut into pieces, brought to a tub grinder at a local green waste facility and mulched. And while mulch in and of itself is not a bad thing, in fact, it's a very helpful utilitarian thing, it offers no connection or homage or respect to the tree as a living being in our community. So it developed over time. This is all to say that mindset, that mission, that need to connect was, I don't want to say slow burn because it actually was only like within a couple of years, but relatively slow. So for me to come out of the gate and be like, yes, I right from go was like I just saw it, would be misleading.
I think that's pretty common. Like, I think there is definitely something to that journey. I mean, you mentioned Joseph Campbell, like maybe not necessarily hero's journey in terms of the exact steps, but it's that similar idea of like we have to try, explore some ideas. Maybe they work, maybe they don't, and so that notion of like finding something that resonates. I saw on your Instagram some benches, some work in progress benches that you were labeled as a life cycle project. So
Mm.
the trees were returning to where they were removed from, but in this new form. So when you think about getting that reassurance in a way that your mission is landing, that it's resonating with people, like what are some of the examples you point to? Is it stuff like life cycle projects where people want to say, yes, that tree came from here, but we can honor it by turning it into benches? Or is it another project? Like what has given you sort of that reassurance or that feeling like your mission is the right one to pursue?
We've been really fortunate with this. Right from go, even just in kind of anecdotal market research, any designer that I knew, I asked ahead of time, and they were like, "Oh boy, locally sourced wood would just be so great." So the design community was on board. A lot of the woodworking community was on board because a lot of them had ad hoc milled trees locally, and they know A, how special it is to connect with that tree, and B, how much work it is to mill a tree into lumber. So we initially, right from go, had a really great adoption. Like we didn't have to really like get very smarmy. I mean, people were on board right from go. Um, I think to your point, yes, over time we honed it even further by saying, do you have trees that are coming out from the site of your job that we could reutilize back into the project that you're working on? Like that really was like the end. That was like, wow. It's not like we're not only taking a tree from, North Hollywood and using it in a project in uh, Altadena. That in and of itself is mind blowing for a lot of people. But now we're taking it from the site in North Hollywood and we're putting it back into the site in North Hollywood. People were just like, oh my God. Because a lot of times what ends up happening is the people, especially in residential projects that were close to that tree, it just, it just, it just breaks them to have to remove a tree. Or, sometimes it's a have to remove a tree, or sometimes like the tree does just wind blow, or it's dying or dead or fell on your house or whatever it is. Um, but there's this loss and this grief that comes with it, which is actually, in my mind, actually is wonderful because it shows that people are connected. There's like this deep seated thing in our DNA that's like even no matter how disconnected we are, that we still have those inklings within us that get awakened or perked up, you know, um, which is great. So as sad as and as grieving as that process is for people, it's also beautiful and cathartic and connective and yeah, so that really resonates.
Awesome. And this next question's a little bit out there, so hopefully you'll follow me and venture out into this space. So
Mhm.
one of our past episodes with this guy, this artist named Urson Han Urson. He's of this artist collective Marshmallow Laser Feast. Trees are a big element of a lot of the work that they do. And he asked this question while we were recording. He was like, one of the things I think about is like, what is it like to be a tree? How can I translate
Mm.
this to other people? And it was interesting. You were just talking about how people sometimes have these deep connections to trees that for whatever reason they need to be removed. And so it's amazing when they can sort of bring them back in this other form. Um, do you, as a former carpenter, as someone who founded a lumber yard, but a very unique lumber yard, like, do you think about what it's like to be a tree? Do you think about what it's like to be different types of trees or in like different types of environments? Like, is there that connection you have with the tree? Do you think about that?
This is not out there. Or maybe it is, but I'm right here with you. You might, yeah. I'm also going to say what my response might be out there too. I do often think about that. I don't think that I know what it's like to be a tree or a bird or soil or a river. I don't. I often wonder, and I do my best as one of the guys, one of the gang, to find some common ground. And this is I think this is the first time I've ever talked about this publicly, but I often sit and communicate, with trees, or try and listen. Um, and what I often receive is not words, but it is messaging, and it is. I do think I find some common ground with trees, and it's not to say do I know what it's like to exist as a tree. No, but I ask often, and I get answers. I have like a common trope that I ask trees is first, what have you experienced, or what have you been experiencing in your immediate life? And then I usually get a flood of answers. I guess you'd call them answers, or whatever you'd want to call it, communication. And that just gives me a lot of joy. It's very grounding. I try to do it. I try to do it daily. It doesn't often happen. I have a Shyness mole, a Peruvian pepper tree right outside my little work cabin here that basically started all this for me. I would just go under there and sit down and just meditate and be still and just listen. And I felt like, wow, this tree is really my pal. Um, so I know I'm probably going off topic here, but do I know what it's like to be a tree? No. Do I wonder about what it is to be a tree? A lot. And do I desperately want to know more? Yes. And also, do I do I do I wonder what it's like to be not just a tree, but any of those other one of the gang members that we're talking about? And is there common tissue, and is there common thread? Is there what are the common, is there common energetic elements to it? I'm dying to know. But in the meantime, I just listen and ask questions, and I think that's the biggest thing.
So you in the Wonderground piece, you have this quote: "I talk with trees
Yep.
in our deep-seated fear for our changing planet." And we could simply listen to instead of pontificate about the needs for the more than human world.
Mm.
And we're in this space where the planet is changing, the climate is changing. You're taking this approach as sort of one of the gang. Like, your gang members are also experiencing what you're experiencing, maybe in a different way. As things change, as someone who
Mm.
runs a lumber yard, but also as someone who's very thoughtful and is a thoughtful human being, like, how do you see things, how do you think you might experience as things change? Like, are you preparing for it? Are you thinking about what this might mean to your business, or more as a human? You mentioned you have kids as well. Like, how are you wrestling with that change?
Well, I would say, as far as being a business owner goes, I hope no investors are listening to this episode. The business itself is great. I love Angel City Lumber with all my heart. It's one of my children. But the economic system at which we are operating is not necessarily like what it is not at all what gets me up in the morning. So, to answer your question, that element is a means to an end. Us running a profitable business and a sound financial institution, is we're doing that because we just need to do that in order to exist in this economic system that we live in, and that's it. Uh, no one at Angel City Lumber has any delusions of grandeur that we are going to become lumber barons, or that we are just, you know what I mean? This is not, it's not an option. So let me just first say that, as far as like me thinking about climate change and how that will affect our business is like, I don't know. It's going to affect our business like it's going to affect everything else. Um, how do I think about it as one of the gang? I think what I'm most after is by saying listening, and I had mentioned earlier about not putting ourselves as humans outside of the circle or above the circle of community, or with all of the, all our relations, but actually being in there, one of the gang. You called to that thing I said in Wonderground. The key word there is, to me, is listening, as opposed to pontificating, as I'm saying, because I do feel like the human impulse to fix, and the human impulse, um, that we are so smart and we have this intelligence that is above other creatures. I mean, I was reading this book the other day that refers to the other members of the gang as the lower animals, and it's like, yeah, if we're operating from that spot, from that place, from that perspective, I don't think we're going to be in harmony very much. I think we're just going to keep perpetuating what's happening, and we're just going to keep, going down, 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 down. The act of listening, I feel like, is way more mutualistic than pontificating. I feel like the pontificating is more of top down. We're gonna run this show. We're gonna save the earth. I love that. That always happens. that phrasing. I think if we just say, like, we don't need to save anything or do anything. We just need to listen and try to be an awareness of what everything else is saying, what everyone else is saying, um, and have our actions stem from that. Um, I just think we're really, like, just getting carried away with ourselves. It's often like, as a parent, I'm often in the position of where I'm like, well, this is what I need for my kid. This is what my kids need, right? And I'm going to tell them what they need, and they need to abide by this, and this is how the world works, et cetera, et cetera. And I notice that often when I just listen to them, and I listen to where they're at, I'm like, oh, that I was not even close. I wasn't even close to what they're going through. I just needed to listen. And then in their listening, I'm like, oh, that's what you're going through. Well, let me lend a hand. Let me help.
So, one other thing I wanted to ask you about is, you have this really unique partnership with the Angeles National Forest. You mentioned earlier in our conversation how, if a tree in an urban area is downed, it just kind of gets chopped up and made into mulch. And something of unique concern in California is obviously wildfires. And so this unique partnership you have with the Angeles National Forest, you help remove the buildup of dead trees that are actually, like, supercharging these wildfires in a way. How did that partnership come about? With all the things you talked about and the sources of inspiration and information that you have, like, what considerations are you taking to make sure that you're leaving what's there that helps build up the soil and provide habitat, while also being able to help avoid some of these wildfires and things that are definitely encroaching on our sort of human existence within this world?
Yeah. It's this really beautifully opportune time in the Angeles National Forest, for us, because elsewhere in the nation, what's happening is, there are a lot of wood and or biomass manufacturing facilities around national forests, and the federal government put out a series of grants for, to your point, helping get surplus deadwood, snag trees, hazard trees, there's a quota, essentially, that is best for the forest to keep that dead wood in the forest. But also, to your point, through lack of participation, frankly, and lack of management and lack of resources over the centuries, or over the decades, I mean, it's just overgrown. And so it does supercharge those forest fires. Um, in getting into partnership with the Forest Service, our local forest, national forest, is the Angeles National Forest, uh, part of which is in Los Angeles County, 50 miles from our sawmill. We we basically started interfacing with them because we were partnered on a grant through a company, a nonprofit called Woodworks, and Woodworks uh, basically employs people that are re-entering the job force, whether they were formerly incarcerated or houseless, other possibilities as well, and they train them as woodworkers, and they utilize wood and sell wood products and wares. Um, it's fantastic, and they said they applied for a grant through the Forest Service, and they got the grant, and the grant was to produce wood products from wood from the forest that was hazard trees or snacks. Well, they called us in as a partner because they were like, well, yeah, we can get the logs, but like, we're woodworkers. We're not like, how do we make the logs into lumber? So we need Angel City lumber. So they've got us into it. Um, and then while we were interfacing with the Forest Service, I was like, well, I mean, it sounds like this is a problem for you guys. We're a lumber mill. And they were like, what? And then I said, well, and they were like, well, what kind of board footage are you producing? I think they just thought we were like just a guy with a mill. And I was like, and I told them how much we produced, and they were like, well, that's like, that's technically a commercial mill. It's the lowest possible rung on the ladder, but it is technically. And then that got them thinking like, okay, well, let's start interfacing with you guys. The reason why it's so opportune is because like I got to read their management plan, and I was like, wow, this is really wonderful and insightful. And I was like, this is really great. Um, and then on top of that, there has never been, well, I don't know if that's true. They said to their knowledge, they can't remember a timber sale ever happening in the Angeles National Forest. So it's never been a timber forest. And why is that interesting is because in other parts of the country where they have been timber forests, I think we're very entrenched in this industrial forestry model. And I'm just gonna go ahead and say I don't think it's the best model, right? So now we're interfacing with the Forest Service down here in a way that has never, it's nascent in this process. And it's like, wow, we could actually do this model in a more intentional way we have more knowledge now, more understanding. And we could say like, hey, we're never going to clear cut. We're never going to like succession plant trees in the Angeles. We're going to take trees that have grown there naturally, that are falling on a picnic table or whatever. And there's a lot. And we're going to utilize utilize those trees into lumber. So I think it becomes this more intentional way of interfacing with the Forest Service than lumber production has been in the past. And it also helps the Forest Service be more participatory with the forest. The Forest Service is also way more open to and learning about all these indigenous practices that, early on was just jettisoned and okay, we can't do that. Now they're like, oh no, we need to do that. So we're returning back to that, which is great. So yeah, it's a really cool partnership, and we feel really grateful and really excited.
So when we think about Angel City Lumber, you're working with fallen trees. Some folks might ask, what's next? That might not be enough to sort of meet lumber needs. So have you thought about that? Like what comes next? Is there anything in mind of how to create something that's a little bit more, sort of long term, but also be able to produce more than just fallen trees?
Yes. So it's a stopgap. Our current model is a stopgap. We're taking trees that have been often planted willy-nilly in the urban forest. They fall, they die, we take them. That's not really a very holistic model, right? So the plan is the next iteration of ACL is really a forestry focused endeavor. I would love to create a coppice woodland. And a coppice woodland is the way humans the world over had managed forests for millennia before industrial lumber. So essentially what that is we're taking trees, like if we were growing trees that were sound, not monocultures, groups of species that were sound for that particular growing site, that particular, whether it's an alluvial plain, a floodplain, a mountainside, or whatever, how it best fits the flora and fauna of that particular area. And you essentially rotate harvest. So let's just say there's 100 acres. And every year you harvest 4 acres of that 100 acres. Okay? So you would cut those trees at the base of the tree, and you would leave the stump. And there are a lot of species that will reshoot from the stump. Then you leave that 4 acres alone to reshoot and continue to grow. Then you move on, year 2, you go to the next 4 acres, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the 26th year, if that math is correct, you are back at the first 4 acres at which you harvested. Well, at that point, they are now 25-year-old coppice shoots that are now of diameter and of straightness for lumber harvest. And the stool has grown, and the tree has grown. And by the way, the flora and fauna has boomed. There's a whole set of, there's an ecosystem when a coppice is first cut. There's an ecosystem at mid coppice level, and there's a third ecosystem at mature coppice. So that is where, like, the word regenerative gets thrown around a lot. I do think like that's an actual, yes, trees regenerate, plants regenerate. So if we are managing them better, we don't need to succession plant and clear cut. We need to just do it differently, return to how we used to do it.
Fantastic. I love that. I'm all about the one, looking back to looking forward, but two, being able to say, like, there's a different way to do this. There's another way we can think about that.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Before we wrap up our conversation, is there anything else you'd like to share about sort of mission, the idea, like Angel City Lumber, and what you'd like people to know about it?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really get to it, but this idea of participation and reciprocity. So reciprocity, I know, is a big word that, again, we talk about Robin Wall Kimmerer, we talk about David Abram, we talk about this notion of like mutuality and reciprocity. I think that's something that I also just wanted to bring up as like a cornerstone of why we're doing what we're doing. I think it's one thing to utilize wood from fallen trees is great. However, what are we giving back? And that's where we're hoping that the storytelling element is serving. Instead of being served by the trees all the time, how are we serving them back? And I think this notion of mutuality is something that I think is becoming more part of the zeitgeist, thankfully. But I think in something as status quo industrial as lumber in the United States, introducing or reintroducing, I should say, this concept of, cool, how are we giving back is the reason why we want to tell the story of all these trees. We want to carry on that legacy. We want to honor these trees, and that's the way in which we're trying to give back.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I think that is a great way to bring our conversation to a close. Again, some of these foundational ideas that I think are really meaningful, and people just how the approach being one of the gang. So thanks so much, Jeff, for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking time to record an episode of the podcast.
Thanks so much, Rick. I really enjoyed talking with you.